Hello, welcome back. In the previous classes, we were discussing English poetry. In fact, we began with the origins of English poetry, and we acquainted ourselves with English poetry during Chaucer's times and Chaucer's contribution to English poetry, and then we moved on to the introduction of sonnets and Shakespearean sonnets, and then metaphysical poetry and Milton. And in that series, this is going to be the last lecture. Here we are going to take you through poetry from English poetry, especially from 17th century onwards through modern poetry. Here let us begin this with poetry during the Restoration period. This period is very interesting because aided by the print culture and social mobility. In fact, if you can recall, by then print culture was beginning to spread its influence. As a result of which, the middle class had a kind of an unintermittent access to literature. So, because of this kind of exposure, there were literature in general received a kind of a major fillip. So, generally Restoration period is also called the age of enlightenment, because here there is a kind of a deviation. If you compare poetry during this period with poetry during a little earlier, especially Elizabethan poetry, there is a kind of a marked shift in the way human beings perceived the society around, and this was also the age that witnessed a kind of a spread of rationality. That is why you have Alexander Pope, a remarkable poet, acknowledging the influence of the scientific works of Newton. He says, God said, let Newton be, and all was light. So, here in this neoclassical period, poetry, as opposed to the poetry of Elizabethan period, is moderated more by reason and wit. It is moderated more by reason and wit, and the predominant literary form, especially in poetry that was practiced, was mock heroic poetry, because society had grown weary of heroic poetry, and a kind of a welcome change was required. Therefore, satires, this age characterizes the more than the arrival, you can say satire, it was popularized. Therefore, mock heroic poetry, especially written in heroic couplets, that becomes the norm. We begin with Alexander Pope. In fact, scholars of English literature say that after Shakespeare, it is Alexander Pope who is whose quotations are widely followed even to this day. So, that is the contribution of Alexander Pope. So, again here too, in fact, he makes use of heroic couplets in a mock epic format, and here his command of language, his command of decorum and diction, especially in the form of satire, is totally unparalleled. So, some of his important works include Rape of the Lock, The Dunciad, Essay on Man, and all of them ridicule the kind of high culture. So, the lampooning of society in terms of its affectations, affectations in terms of aristocracy and all that. These are some of the popular themes in Alexander Pope's poetry. Please remember, we are just introducing you to some of these major poetic figures, and the purpose of this class is basically introductory in nature. All right. So, I am introducing you to the broad contours of English poetry through some of its important practitioners. From Alexander Pope to John Dryden. John Dryden is basically a satirist, In fact, John Dryden is the first poet laureate of England. So, he is the first poet laureate of England. Again, he too mastered the use of heroic couplets, and his important works are Mac Flecknoe, Absalom and Achitophel and all that. Especially it's said of Mac Flecknoe that it's a kind of a political satire of a fellow poet, with whom he didn't see eye to eye. Therefore, that's been turned into a kind of a political satire. Later British writers consider John Dryden as a kind of a father of political satire, especially in poetry, because he almost perfected the genre. From John Dryden, we move on to William Blake. In fact, if you can recall, we said that William Blake acts as a precursor to romantic poetry as such. Though officially speaking, romantic poetry begins with the publication of Wordsworth and Coleridge's Lyrical Ballads. Groundwork was done through the poetic works of William Blake. So, even here there is a kind of a marked shift in the poetic sensibility. In fact, again, please remember, with every generation there is a kind of a marked shift in the poetic sensibility. So, if the Restoration poetry was a kind of a revolt against the earlier Elizabethan poetry and all that, Romantic poetry is a kind of a revolt against Restoration poetry. So, William Blake's contribution to English poetry in general is something remarkable. Unfortunately, during his lifetime, William Blake was not so much given credit for his genius. In fact, during his lifetime, he was a kind of an ignored genius. It's only now, especially in the 20th century, that the world has come to understand the greatness of his contribution, especially to the world of poetry. Especially to the world of poetry, because he has a kind of an equal contribution to painting. During his time, he was well known for his painting too. Therefore, you can call him a kind of multifaceted artist. He was a poet, a painter, an engraver, more than that, mystic and visionary. Blake believed that poetry to him, he saw his poetry in dreams. That was a statement. He stated that he just sees all his poems as dreams, as some kind of visions, and when he wakes up, he just writes them down. In that sense, he believed that his poetry is a kind of handed down to humanity from angels and meta-human creatures that he met in his dreams. He is a kind of an iconoclastic poet, because again, a sensitive reader would find a cogent and a powerful critique of society during his time. If you look at his poetry, we find a kind of a powerful critique of orthodoxical practices, socio-political and ecclesiastical excesses that the ruling class practiced. So, his poetry is a kind of a shift towards the subaltern. You can find a shift towards the subaltern via nature. William Blake, there's another reason why probably all of us may have heard of William Blake. That's because because of his two important poetical works, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. He believed it's a kind of a transition that human life has to pass through, when you are born until through your childhood, you are innocent, that characterizes our life. But as we walk into adult life, well, if we continue to be innocent, well, that so much becomes ignorance than innocence. So you need to know the world from a different perspective, otherwise the world, you may consider the world as highly unrealistic, harsh and all that. Therefore, you need to understand it from the perspective of experience. Therefore, he comes out with another collection called the Songs of Experience. And afterwards, interestingly, during the third phase, he goes back and says it's the Songs of Innocence again. It's a kind of a circle. Innocence passes through experience and comes back and remains innocence. Some of his popular poems include London, the Tiger, and all that. Especially, you must have heard of these remarkable lines: "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night." So his poetry is again is replete with symbolism, and this symbolism is a kind of, it's not the worldly symbolism that we later come to find in the modern poetry. So this symbolism was influenced by an understanding of myths, legends, and his Christian background and all that, and his understanding of the Bible. So we can call William Blake a kind of a precursor to, a forerunner to romantic poetry. Here is a poem, London. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind forged manacles I hear. And he literally believed it. In fact, it's not just a product of imagination. He really said that he felt all that in his dreams. So some kind of angels dictated his verse, angels dictated his painting, and he only gave voice to their spirit, their messages. That was his belief. From William Blake, we move on to the more romantic phase of poetry, romantic period. As I said, if there is a kind of a shift in the sensibility, the shift is this. During the neoclassical period, it was more a kind of a universal theme. It was more a kind of reason oriented approach towards everything. But here the approach and emphasis is more on the subjective turn. So you can call it a kind of a subjective turn in poetry. So what is subjective turn, you may ask? It's more towards looking inward rather than looking outward. It's more towards looking inward, looking at our own emotions, looking at our heart, and then speaking. More than that, romantic period of poetry is marked by a heavy tilt towards nature. In fact, nature acts as a kind of a language to them more than theme. In fact, a lot of discussion has happened as far as the rich portrayal of nature is concerned in romantic poetry. But if you carefully look at their poetry, you realize that nature more or less acts as language. More than a theme, it acts as a language. So it becomes a medium through which they find an expression to the human turmoils, human vices and virtues and all that. So nature provides a rich scope for these poets to explore their own inner lives. Of course, this is where you understand, you come face to face with Wordsworth and Coleridge, and especially how they foregrounded a marked shift in the poetic sensibility, especially in the preface that they write, preface to Lyrical Ballads. They talk about their poetics of romantic period. So for them, poetry was basically a kind of a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility. That's a kind of a definition for them. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, but that happens when the emotion is recollected in tranquility. There is a pause between that. It's not that it's a kind of an outpouring of a spontaneous outpouring. Well, when you recollect it, then of course recollect not casually. When you recollect it during your peaceful and tranquil state of mind, that's when you can produce poetry. So as I said, for them, for a romantic poet, their perception of the outside world, when we say outside world, it's nature, society, anything, it's basically shaped by somebody's inward reconfiguration. There is a kind of oneness. When there is a kind of oneness between what one thinks and what one feels with what one finds outside, you can produce great poetry. That was the belief. These are some remarkable lines by William Wordsworth. Especially Tintern Abbey, that's his important work. Tintern Abbey is a major poem that William Wordsworth wrote. Lucy poems. So these are some well known poems that we are familiar with. And when it comes to Coleridge, again, their joint venture created lyrical ballads. Coleridge is another important poetic genius who was a friend of William Wordsworth, and he also wrote an important critical piece called Biographia Literaria, in which he foregrounds a major distinction between fancy and imagination, and how imagination is a higher form, and in order for us to write poetry, we need not fancy, of course, because if your poetry is a product of fancy, then it does not have a lasting impact. On the other hand, if it is a product of your imagination, a rich creativity, then of course poetry achieves a kind of a lasting impact. So some of Coleridge's well known works are The Rime of Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan, and all of them. From here we come to other romantics. When we say the late romantics, especially John Keats, Shelley, and Byron, they continue the romantic ideals that Wordsworth and Coleridge proposed. Unfortunately, all of them met an untimely death. Nevertheless, their contribution to poetry in general is significant. So they practice odes. So ode to West Wind, ode to Nightingale, all of them are quite important poetic pieces. Keats's concept of negative capability, in fact, that's a very important concept. He says that uncertain, for a neoclassical writer, clarity of mind is very, very important, because there it's the reason orientation is rationality is a defining trait. That's true more or less for even metaphysical poetry, but here more than certainty, clarity, for a poet, a state of ambiguity becomes important, a state of uncertainty becomes important. Therefore, doubts, mysteries, uncertainties, they act as a kind of a starting point for poetry to explore, because poetry does not deal with certainties. It basically travels in some kind of in between zones. That's why. So uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, they provide a fertile ground for poetry to emerge. They come out of the gray areas, the subconscious. That's the reason why uncertainty is celebrated here. From here we come to Victorian poetry. Even in Victorian poetry, again there is a kind of a marked shift from the earlier poetry, romantic poetry. So, if there is one type of poetry that this period preferred, it's dramatic monologues. A dramatic monologue has some kind of shades of soliloquies. In soliloquies in a play, a character speaks in order to bear his or her mind. A character starts speaking. Dramatic monologues are a kind of a poetic equivalence of that. Tennyson is considered the poet laureate of the Victorian period. So, I am just rushing through some of them, and then we have Matthew Arnold, another important literary figure of this period. Matthew Arnold is another important literary figure. So, Dover Beach is a kind of a poetic manifesto here. The sea is calm tonight, the tide is full, the moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone, the cliffs of England stand glimmering and vast out in the tranquil bay. That is how the poem begins. It is an extraordinary poetic piece. When time permits, of course, you can read this poem. From Victorian poetry, we come straight to modern poetry. Modern poetry, you will have to keep in mind, there is, in order for us to understand modern poetry or modern literature, we need to understand the background in which it is written. By the time modernism began in literature as a kind of a movement, you have already seen the world wars. There is a kind of an isolation, there is a kind of helplessness and industrialization which began during the Victorian time, has already come to threaten the human way of life as human society knew it. So, in other words, it is a kind of a transition, a great transition period. So, in order to understand modern poetry, we have to keep all these things in mind, industrialization and the entire world torn apart because of the Great World War. As a result of that, isolation, alienation. So, these are some of the predominant themes of modern poetry. In fact, if you look at poetry, especially written during this time, you come to see what alienation is, what isolation is, and all that. So, here of course, there were some extraordinary experiments that took place. In fact, modern poets did a tremendous experiment here, influenced by various movements in the world of painting and art. In poetry, there were a lot of experimentations, all right. So, and symbolism too. Poets, symbolism is a kind of a defining trait of modernism, where poets infused object, people, places and events with significant meanings. In other words, rather than being direct, so through symbols, poets began exploring the theme of alienation, isolation, and the disintegration of the world. So, that is why you have Yeats almost saying, the falcon cannot hear the falconer and all that. There is no link between the inner spirit and our actions. So, this kind of alienation. So, Yeats is a very important figure. In fact, if two voices stand out in poetry, modernist poetry, it is W. B. Yeats and T. S. Eliot. W. B. Yeats is, his poetry is characterized by disillusion. Of course, as I said, you have to understand the society in which he wrote it, and there is also, as far as his Irish background is concerned, even there was a kind of a national movement. Entire Ireland was in the grips of national movement. Therefore, his poetry is characterized by bitter satire, strong disillusionment, disenchantment with the modern values, symbolism and all that. So, in his a prayer for my daughter, though it is a kind of a personal one, he vents out all these things, and in a kind of a visionary way he prays how the modern world should seek its anchor from some other ideals, not the ideals that the society has come to believe in during the modern times, but some other ideals. And this is where in fact he was also influenced by Indian philosophy and Indian wisdom. So, in many of his poems you find frequent reference to the wisdom from the Indian Upanishads and the Vedas and all that. So, he finds that an ideal, an ideal. So, these are some just to give you a kind of a taste of how he writes. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. W.B. Yeats is also important for another reason. He was almost obsessed with Maud Gonne. Unfortunately, Maud Gonne never accepted his love, and his love for Maud Gonne, a kind of unrequited love for Maud Gonne, it finds a rich expression in his poetry. In fact, what is remarkable is how he converts his personal disappointment, personal disappointment in love, how he transforms that into a creative force and writes extraordinary poetry, writes extraordinary poetry. And at that state of mind, you begin looking at the world as, there are no strangers here, only friends you haven't yet met. So, at a different state of mind, that's when it's a realized state of mind, after disillusion, after disenchantment, you come to a stage where you begin looking at things from a broad perspective, and in that state of mind you begin looking at everybody not as a stranger, but a friend yet to be made, a friend yet to be met, something like that. Yeah, we have T.S. Eliot, we have discussed his Wasteland is again a very it's a kind of a watershed, it's a very important piece, as far as modernism is concerned. And both T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats, these are they are Nobel laureates in literature. So, their poetry has a significant influence on poets, the younger poets. So, this is an excerpt from the Wasteland. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain, and all this. It's again in a very difficult piece of writing, but for them poetry was not something that should be easily accessible to people. In fact, that's a kind of a concept that modernism believed in. If you wanted to understand poetry, you need to put you had to put a lot of efforts to understand. When somebody criticizes Eliot for using symbols from Hebrew culture, he said, unless one strives to be worthy of poetry, poetry is not for everybody. Poetry, not everybody can access poetry, something like that. So, from T.S. Eliot we come to Phillip Larkin and Ted Hughes. Again, these are remarkable poets. These are just some major names. In fact, we have to leave out in a short course such as this. We will not be doing justice to even the writers we represent here. But as I said, the purpose of these classes is to shed broad light on their poetic persona and introduce you to their poetic genius. Of course, not do justice there, it becomes impossible. That is the reason why we are unable to discuss any of them in detail. Phillip Larkin and Ted Hughes, they employ traditional tools of poetry, generally speaking, and they play a major role, especially Phillip Larkin. He is a prominent poet of his generation and a leading voice, and he later floats a group of young English writers called the Movement, and they reject the neoclassical, the neo-romantic styles of W. B. Yeats and Dylan Thomas, and write poetry in altogether a different way. In fact, it's their poetry which later paves the ground for postmodern poetry, you know. So, this is in a nutshell a kind of English poetry for us. So, if you can quickly recall, we began with Chaucer, a little earlier than that Beowulf, and then we discussed poetry during the Elizabethan period, especially sonnets, Philip Sidney, Shakespeare, metaphysical poetry, and now we have discussed modern poetry. The purpose of these lectures is to give you a kind of an overview, an overview of British poetry, something like this. So, in the next class we begin with poetry from other parts of the globe. We begin with Indian English poetry, and maybe in another week we can take up poetry from across the globe. That's it. So, until then, take care. Bye bye.